what do I do? Do I click go ahead?
Okay. No, let me just tell everybody, Dumelang everybody. Thank you for joining us. Umoya Ulight, Umoya Upright. Welcome to another episode of Black Wednesdays. I'm going to hand over to that is Steve right away. Um, we are at school, we are students, we're listening. Bra Steve, good evening.
Hi, good evening, Ziggy. And
How are
good
you, my
evening.
elder?
I'm okay, and you? And good evening to our viewers.
Oh, wonderful. As usual, we're excited to hear from you. We've got our pad and our pens and papers out, ready to take note. Um, yeah, it's so funny because we're still around PW Botha, right? We're around the 80s now.
Yes, yes. In fact, yeah, we are still around 1984 in Ziggy. The reason why we keep moving back and forth around 1984 is that what happens in exile begins to impact, quite directly what happens inside the country. But just to recap, Ntiki, we are still talking, and I think this is what I need to impress upon people here, that the entire series is actually, an attempt to account for the Black radical tradition, in South Africa. And I think I insist on it, because the Black radical tradition should be, historically, it has always been a part of, a paradigm in the South African liberation struggle. But over the years, particularly, and this is why Black Wednesday is so important. Anytime beyond Black Wednesday, the Black radical tradition in South Africa is subjected to a systematic assault. And this time it is not only from the apartheid state or from the white supremacy state. I think part of what I'm trying to demonstrate, is that the Congress tradition also played quite a critical role in the destruction of the Black radical tradition. And it did this not only inside South Africa in the 1980s, but it also did so, in exile. And this actually begins in 1981. And the point I was making, just to recap on what we talked about last week, is that the period 1981 to 1983 is absolutely important to understand, what the MK would have been doing, in exile in that period. And I think I said it was my assertion that during this period, 1981 to 1983, that the ANC consumed itself, trying to clean up its house and get rid completely of the black radical tradition inside the ANC. But how is this black radical tradition identified and labeled? It is those recruits of the ANC who are coming out of the 1970s mass movement. In particular, they come out of the 1976, uprising. And let's, for a moment, avoid using Soweto and just say it was a mass movement of the 1970s, precisely because it did spread across the country. But we do understand that Soweto was the epicenter of that movement. So, what we are accounting for here is that the Black radical tradition would have, persisted throughout the 20th century until 1977 with Black Wednesday, when a systematic assault was directed at it. And that was the banning of all Black consciousness, movement and organizations. That we have accounted for. And I think we explained that, fully. But then we centered P.W. Botha for purposes of understanding, how the Black radical tradition reimagines itself and reconstitutes itself after the Black Wednesday episode. And we are now looking into the 1980s. And part of what I did was, to break down this theme into two component parts. The one was to look at the exiled politics, and in particular, to focus on the ANC and MK, and maybe you might say the Congress Alliance, and MK as its armed formation. We have been focusing on that. We talked about the Koch Street shooting and Solomon Mahlangu, the Silverton siege, and the many other attacks, cross-border attacks of MK between 1978 and 1982, roughly. We have explained all of that. And maybe one might say that was actually the golden age, of MK activism, during that period. But I did explain that some of it, we identified some of the people who would have been inside the country since 1979 up to around 1982. We identified the kinds of, campaigns and activities that they undertook. In the Northern Transvaal, we had Mteteleli Mncube. I explained everything about him. Then we had all attacks around the police stations in Soweto, in Pretoria, and all over the place. And ultimately, that leading to trials such as that of the Moroka Three, who were executed in 1984 on the 9th of June, 1984. But that, in a nutshell, was trying to give, what a kind of a picture of what actually happened to the Jews, to the class of 76, once they went into exile and joined the ANC. But the particular cohort that we have been focusing on are those that actually went into military training and were in military camps. We have spoken, about those. Now, the issue here is that 1981 becomes a very critical moment because what happens in January 1981, I explained that it's the Matola raid, the raid of the SADF into Matola. It is important to understand how the ANC responds to this because what it does immediately is to zero in on the new recruits and actually suspect that the new recruits are in fact apartheid spies, who are planted inside the ANC and MK. And they start a witch hunt. We talked about, that witch hunt lasting between 1981 and 1983. But I also said that this accounts for the decline in the number of cross-border activity into South Africa. But at the same time here, part of what I should have explained and probably didn't is the fact that the US is becoming particularly interested in the subcontinent, Southern Africa, in its war, against the Soviet Union. And they actually sent the chief of the CIA, William Casey, to South Africa to have meetings with the South African Defense Force and the police. But he also had meetings, with the security forces in Mozambique, and this becomes interesting. And what the CIA was selling in 1982 was the idea that, the SADF should scale down on its aid to Renamo so that they can have some kind of stability in Mozambique because they were envisaging a kind of a negotiated settlement, across Southern Africa that would include Namibia, South Africa. By the time Zimbabwe was already, independent, if you like. But all of this happens around 1981, 82. And in Zimbabwe, you begin to have dissident activities. I will explain dissident activities at some point. But what is important here is that Gukura Hundi actually happens at this time, around 1981, 82. And that is what actually focuses Mugabe's attention. So as these things are developing on the subcontinent, it is at this time, Zimbabwe is out of the picture for a while. And, the focus is actually on Angola, where UNITA and MPLA are at war. And also SWAPO actually being involved with the SADF. And it is in this context that the National Executive Committee of the ANC decides to deflect, the kind of unrest and,
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Sorry. Yes, I thought at least we get a chance to um
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I'm hearing something so interesting because I get we're only learning our geopolitics now. When you
Yes.
say SWAPO and Angola and Namibia, SWAPO, and then you say they used to work with the SADF, does that mean that this current political, because they control Namibia now, right?
Yes.
It's the same
Okay.
party.
Yes. Let me quickly explain this. In the subcontinent at this time, in 1980, you had Zimbabwe becoming independent. Now, what was left was for South Africa and Southwest Africa to get the independence. The common factor here was South Africa and the SADF. South Africa was actually presiding over Southwest Africa as a trusteeship of the United Nations. And for decades, the United Nations had passed a resolution, Resolution 435, which was putting pressure on South Africa to allow for a democratic process in in at the time Southwest Africa. This is why SWAPO was actually also in exile, and they too were in exile both in Zambia with the ANC as well as in Angola. So SWAPO formed part of this kind of a grouping, of liberation struggle formations that were supported by the Soviet Union. It was SWAPO, the MPLA, and ZIPRA, of the Zimbabwe African People's Organization of, Joshua Nkomo. Those were actually supported by the Soviet Union.
Mm.
And on the other hand, in Southwest Africa, you did not have a very strong opposition in exile to SWAPO. SWAPO was almost considered the sole liberation struggle formation. But for Zimbabwe, you had ZANU in power, and ZAPU was actually out of power. At some point, they formed the Patriotic Front. But when we talk about the dissident activity, ZIPRA and ZAPU were always incriminated, and that becomes an explanation for Gukirahundi. But we'll talk about that, some other time. The issue here
Okay.
is that the US was actually getting itself involved directly in what was happening on the subcontinent. And already by 1982, they were putting up forward a kind of a negotiated settlement kind of thing on the subcontinent that would have affected both South Africa and Namibia. Now, that was the issue around 1982-83. But the point I'm making here is that during this period, you are having a decline in cross-border insurgency. So that can be explained to this kind of crisis going on inside the ANC. In August 1983, the ANC decides to deal with this crisis, in their ranks. And what they do is to actually deploy an entire brigade, to the war front to assist MPLA in their struggle against UNITA. And this deployment lasts between August 1983 up to December 1983. Now, while they were deployed there, something actually happens. There were a number of casualties, of MK people who were fatalities, who died during that engagement. But by December, they were returning to the camps. And already there was a great deal of dissatisfaction among the cadres at this time. In particular, there was a particular unit, which complained about having gone for 3 days without food. And when they got back to Luanda, they decided they wanted to have a meeting with the National Executive Committee of the ANC, and particularly with Oliver Tambo himself. And this was in December 1983, after they had actually come back from the front, after having engaged UNITA there. But then, instead of Tambo actually coming across and meeting, these guys, he was in and around the camps at some point, and he was in Luanda, and this was going into January 1984. And rather than see the mutineers, because that's what they had become, or the protesters, or as the ANC actually referred to them, the reactionaries, the counter-revolutionaries. Tambo decided to go back to Zambia without seeing these guys. In actual fact, in 1984, from January up to August, all of the protest was actually escalating. And at some point, the mutineers decided to go into Luanda and insist on a meeting with the National Executive Committee. But, while on the way to Luanda and 15 kilometers outside the capital, they decided to stop at a place called Vienna, and this is where the Vienna uprising actually happens. Now, a great deal of things happens between, May 1984 and August 1984. But I just want to point out to a few things here. The one thing that happens is that there was a camp called the Pango camp, which was just outside Luanda. Now, when Tambo refused to see these guys, they decided to capture the Pango camp. And over time, they were actually increasing in numbers. And they created quite a storm, around Luanda at this time. On two occasions, the ANC asked, the Angolan government to intervene and, disperse these guys, but the Angolan government and the Cubans actually refused to do that. But this thing went on until, around August. And in the process, the ANC was trying to investigate and find out who were responsible for this uprising. And this, in the ANC language, came to be known as Mkata Shinga. That uprising came to be known as Mkata Shinga. But it is also known as the Vienna uprising. Now, on the 22nd of May 1984, a tribunal was established. The purpose of the tribunal was to investigate the events that happened from January up to May. Where first there was the takeover, of Pango camp and a threat of overthrowing, what would have been, if you like, the Ankh hierarchy in Angola at this time. And the tribunal said on the 22nd of May 1984 to determine the cause of the protest and the mutiny. And what it found is that there were 66 people who could be directly held responsible, for what had been happening. And it was decided that they had to be dealt with quite harshly. Now, 7 out of that 56 were identified. In fact, 15. 7 of those were tried and found guilty, and the sentence was that they were going to be executed with immediate effect. And this was on the 22nd of May 1984, which immediate effect meant on the 24th, 2 days later. The 7 accused, I'm not actually mentioning names here because it's a bit sensitive. I mean, these are people who others came from Soweto, others came from, other parts of black townships in Gauteng, others came from other parts of the country, Eastern Cape and other places as well. But there are those that you may have to mention, because you get a greater significance of what this actually meant. But let's get one thing clear. All of this is happening as part of the campaign called Shishita. And Shishita is in fact intended to clean the ANC, to cleanse it, of any black radical impurities, within the movement. So the 7 that were sentenced and who were supposed to be executed with immediate effect were actually executed on the 24th of May, 1984. And the execution actually involved a firing squad. And the rest of the inmates were made to watch when this actually happened. And someone actually suggested that one of those that were being executed had his father, in the same camp, and the father was made to watch when this actually happened. Now, the most important of these guys who were executed on the 24th was a guy called Ronald Msomi. He was actually from Siskai, and his real name was Tekiso Hoi. Tekiso was actually, held responsible for the entire mutiny, and he was said to have been the leader. And he also happens to have quite an interesting history. His father was a headman in Siskai, and in 1962, his home was burnt down in Siskai in the first MK attack. But nevertheless, he went into exile and actually joined MK. And he was actually executed on the 24th of May 1984. I think people have to keep in mind these dates, because it is important to understand when these things are happening, and at the same time to be able to relate to what is happening inside the country and understand what the impact these things would have on what's happening inside the country at this time. Uh, the last person, and this is not the last person to be executed, because these executions went on until December 1984. But another who was, killed in May 1984, and he died on the 28th of May 1984. This time it wasn't actually, he wasn't executed. He was actually taken into custody and he was in detention at the time. And on the 28th of May, he woke up and he was dead. And the explanation was that he actually used his blanket. He cut, strings from his blanket that he used to hang himself. But when his body was taken out, someone noticed that there was a rope that he may have used, to hang himself. So the question was the rope actually handed to him, to do it, or was he actually lynched? Now, I haven't said who this is, and this is important because it explains this attack on the black radical tradition. This was Ephraim Nkondo. Now, Ephraim Nkondo was the brother of Gesla Nkondo and Curtis Nkondo. And Curtis was actually a well-known black consciousness activist. And at some point, he was actually in the national executive of AZAPO in the 1980s. So the point that I'm making here, I think all this will suffice for now. There's a little more, but I selected, these few facts because they actually drive the point home. The point being that the black radical tradition was imperiled not only by white supremacy state, but also particularly in terms of the liberation struggle formations by the ANC itself. And, the events surrounding Mkatashinga and the Vienna uprising actually sustained this argument. Now, what can we, glean from this? What can we take away from this? Jacob Zuma always says that he's got something on the leaders and that he's about to reveal something. Now, I don't know what it may be, but I'm thinking that when one looks at, MK between 1981 and 1984, and you bring into the equation the role of some of the leadership, that is celebrated inside the ANC, and you want to see what their role was, in this particular interlude, between 1981 and 1984, you then realize that people really had something to account for, that they had a case to answer to. During this period, between January and May 1984, Tambo would receive, updates about what was happening in Angola from time to time. And the people who were actually passing on these messages to OR would have been Joe Mudise himself, Chris Hani, and Thabo Mbeki. From time to time, they would have to give Oliver Tambo an update. And during this period, they have already characterized, this cohort of MK, the June 16 detachment in particular, as counter-revolutionaries, as reactionaries. In fact, in one of the correspondences, Chris actually tells Oliver that, this counter-revolution is actually, getting to its peak, but we are going to deal with it. And he deploys, some people to actually take care of the situation in Angola during this period. So if there's anything that Jacob Zuma really may have against some of the leaders, and it is not this, I'm not too sure what else can actually, overshadow this just in terms of importance. But also, what's the point of this? The point of this is to understand what the situation, in exile was, just in terms of where armed struggle was, and whether it was still a dependable, kind of, or among the pillars of the liberation struggle, whether armed struggle was still a standing pillar, or whether it had actually collapsed as a result of the Nkomati Accord. But I did say that, the immediate consequences of the Nkomati Accord was that it left the ANC and MK in complete disarray, in Maputo. So a great deal of their attention was then, beginning to focus on Tanzania, Zambia, and Angola, because the Nkomati Accord, in fact, according to one historian, after the Nkomati Accord, the ANC was allowed to have about 10 people as diplomatic mission, in Maputo. And there were no more than 150 ANC people in 1985, in all of Mozambique during this period. Now, this is interesting because already you have, inside South Africa, a mass movement, that started in the Valley in 1984. And soon this movement was going to generate a new cohort of recruits for MK, for APA, and also, for Azanla, which would have been established around 1980 or after 1980, after the establishment of the Black Consciousness Movement of South Africa, led by Msibudi Manyela. So by then they had already established a military arm called Azanla. So we are going to have to see how, when young people, the class of 84, the young lions of 84, when forced to leave the country, and they start doing that in quite significant numbers, perhaps in the second half of 1985 and going into 1986. Because during this period, the unrest inside South Africa actually escalates. Tiki, I don't know if there are questions that people want to pose, or should I just, continue? Because, I think also, let me just make this point here.
Okay. Well, it's fine because there's no questions so far.
Okay. The reason why I went back to this was, again, you can see that by the time, Tamizulu's, drama actually enters the stage, already the stage has been set, to deal with particular tendencies inside the ANC and to deal them in the ways in which they dealt with the mutineers, of the Vienna uprising and of Nkatashing. Already that is something that was actually quite, easy to undertake. But at this time, we are now looking at, into 1985 and 1986. And by 1986, we are beginning to have quite a large number, significant number of, the new cohorts coming out of COSAS, coming out of the mass movement of the 1980s, going into exile. Again here, I mean, Mozambique does become the destination, but already you can see that the situation in Mozambique is rather fluid. So it is possible that it only becomes a transit, into Tanzania, Zambia, and Angola. And that, in fact, becomes the case. But another thing that happens here is that the South African security establishment becomes particularly active around the border with Mozambique, in Piet Retief and inside Mozambique, as well as in Swaziland. And there are abductions of, exiles who could be abducted, taken back into the country. One of these, and most important, is actually Glory Sidibe. And Glory Sidibe is abducted in 1986, in August 1986, by operatives of Flag Plus, headed by Eugene de Kock. And he's taken, back to South Africa and, gets to be working out from Flag Plus. And he does a number of, things that are quite, quite sordid. And because he's inside, he's an insider, he knows what is happening. In fact, Glory Sidibe was actually a commander at some point. So this was a valuable, catch for.
Please don't touch the table.
Oh,
It makes this
yeah,
thing shake. And
yeah,
then it's
okay.
going to-
This was a valuable catch for the South African security establishment. And Glory Sidibe was actually responsible for the deaths of a few people, that he could identify and lynch, because that's what he did. And the two others that we know is Nofomela and Joe Mamasela, and their activities too are well known. We are having this thing on the Craddock 4 and also on the Mklenges. And, these are the guys who were responsible for this. So part of what you are seeing in 86 going into 87 is a kind of fluidity between what happens inside South Africa and what is happening in exile. And it is during this period that the ANC comes up with the much vaunted, if you like, Operation Vola, that is actually headed by Meg Maharaj. Let's not spend time on it, but part of what you are seeing here is a kind of, an ANC that's quite desperate to establish its presence inside the country. And this is around 1987. And I'm sure people who are interested in Operation Vola could, quite easily look it up. And you will see that at the center of Operation Vola was actually Meg Maharaj, that inside the country, he would have been the one responsible for it. But here is something else that is absolutely critical. The internal movement, the internal mass movement that started in 1984, and we should actually account for its development from 1978 when P.W. Botha becomes premier. That we haven't done, but I think we will go back to that. It is important for now to explain what's happening inside the country so that we can have a sense, of how developments inside the country were impacted upon by what was happening in exile. One, by the Mkatashinga uprising, and two, by the Mkomati Accord that Mozambique actually got into. Now, what was happening inside the country at this time is that the mass movement is at war. But the mass movement is at war, okay, ostensibly with the apartheid state, and that's understandable. It has to be at war with it. But enemy number one here is the IFP. So, in actual fact, what is happening here is that, whatever kind of campaign that is being undertaken, particularly after 1985, it has to deal with the IFP and the Zulu Amabuto. And this actually happens across across Gauteng, across PWV area, and, also across the hostels. And that becomes, a kind of an engagement, that the mass movement is involved with. But at the same time, what actually adds to the ungovernability of the state is the fact that the labor movement is also, hard at work. Just about every year, you have one industry or the other experiencing work stoppages. And some of these actually turn violent. The one that you can think about was the union that that was affiliated to COSATU, the Union of Railway and Port Workers, called SARU. It had an opponent in the IFP that was UHUSA, and there was war between these unions as well. So it was in that kind of a situation that the developments in exile were becoming rather fluid and flowing into what was happening inside the country. And it is during this period that there was a large scale arms smuggling inside South Africa. AK-47s were a dime a dozen. And just about quite a number of groups were being armed, affiliated either to the ANC or the mass movement, the mass democratic movement. And, these would constitute themselves into what they called SDUs. Now, it becomes clear here that what we had as armed propaganda campaign, which was undertaken by MK between 1978 and 1983, was now giving way to arms being used against the immediate enemy, which would have been the IFP. And between 1987 and 88, we see a great deal of that actually happening. I don't know if one may actually, see the war between AZAPO and the UDF also as being a significant factor, but to some extent it was. In Soweto at the time, the UDF was actually locked in some kind of controversy with AZAPO. And this had to do with things that actually happened here in Deep Kloof. And these are things that had absolutely nothing to do with politics, but, it was a kind of a clash, between, this is at the time when the lines were becoming blurred between what was criminal violence and what was political violence. And those developments in Deep Kloof, that sucked in a gangster from Orlando that was called Makabasa. It is at that point that criminal violence was actually blurring the lines with political violence. And this actually goes on from 1987 to 1989, so that it becomes difficult to see what the impact of Operation Vola would have been, because in fairness, you do not see any attacks on any symbols of white supremacy, or if they were there, they were few and far between, because a great deal of energies were actually being expended, in dealing with, other black formations. And well, the IFP was actually well armed too, being armed by the apartheid state itself. In fact, it is known that some of the IFP operatives were actually trained in the Caprivi Strip with, an SADF unit called Kufut. And it is that, it is in that area where, 6 years earlier, you would have had Gikuria Hundi and the dissident activity taking place quite extensively in that area. I suppose what I, have done here is to account for how the Black radical tradition was dealt with by the ANC in exile. And, by the time people came back, it was quite clear, that the Black radical tradition would have been taking a back seat. The issue here is that, I haven't dealt with the PAC, and I feel it is a little unfair, that we should actually be able to make time and actually focus on the PAC
Yes.
during the same period.
Yes,
But I
can
think-
I jump into there? Can I ask something, guys, Beauty? Because it's
Pardon?
so funny. It's funny you bring up the PAC, because I was thinking about you talking about the intersection between criminality
and the struggle for freedom. And the thing is that even before, you had mentioned like how Poko would also be used in the criminal, that intersection, we see it again. So if you can help us unpack that, that'll be amazing.
But if I can,
If you can help us explore that idea, like how
yes,
when,
yes, Ntiki,
when
yeah,
the criminals take advantage of the cause.
yes, let me do that. With Porto, the interesting thing, I mean, you contrast, Porto's trials with the ANC trials, the Rivonia trial. The Rivonia trial was a media spectacle. You had, media from across the globe, being particularly fascinated by this. You actually get a sense that the Congress Alliance, or Congolese, was given a platform, in the courtroom at Rivonia, in the Pretoria, High Court, that Mandela was actually given a platform to be able to attack black radicalism as well. And, he talks about, I spent my entire life fighting black domination, and I spent my entire life fighting white domination. But that was a platform given to him to attack the black radicalism of the time. And the black domination he was talking about would have been the fact that within the ANC, Africanists were insisting that the ANC should be African in terms of its identity. And he saw that as, a kind of black domination. But in terms of the Porto trials were made up of, the charges would be mostly for murder, and the people murdered or the victims would have been policemen, people who enforced influx control regulations, people who were making the system work. And Porto felt that they were going to deal with those people. But there's one incident, in fact, two, that also illustrate that Porto was prepared to cross the racial divide in terms of pursuing its objectives. And the one, in fact, is, I've talked about this, but for those who may not have been here, was the attack on a white family, a family of four, and a family friend, who were having a picnic along the Mbashi River in Transkei. They used machetes and axes and actually, murdered the five simply because they were white people. So Porto would actually do that sort of thing too. But for them, it had a political content. Here in Kagiso, there was a policeman, who was very notorious for enforcing influx control regulations. Porto operatives in Kagiso, and there I've always stressed that you always had a PAC presence, in Mohlaking and Kagiso, going back to the 1950s. So, the policeman also was taken out by Porto operatives. Now, in all of these trials, the state worked hard to take the political content out of the charges and charge Porto operatives as criminals. And they did that. And these trials were held in regional courts, such as in Grahamstown, for instance, or Craddock, or Port Elizabeth or East London, where there isn't too much media attention. And yet, at the end of all these trials, the accused will be found guilty, sentenced to death, and finally executed. Now, in actual fact, it is estimated that between 1963 and 1968, no less than 97 Porto operatives were executed at Kgosimampuru prison. And it was only much later that their bodies, their remains were being repatriated, mainly to the Eastern Cape too, because that's where the majority actually came from. And South Africans were shocked as to where does all these things come from, precisely because the only trial that South Africans have in their minds of that period was the Rivonia trial. So I've always said that it is in the nature of the Black radical tradition that whenever it emerges, It requires that it be misinterpreted, minimized, misrepresented, and distorted. And this is precisely what has happened. Now, the criminal, I don't know, some people, in fact, if you think about it, and I'm reminded, if you think about it, in 1972, historian Gail Gerhardt interviews Sobukwe in Kimberley, and she's told not to enter the interview room with any writing material, but to speak to Sobukwe and commit everything to memory, and she will write it out wherever she gets to. She did that, but one key question that she asked was Sobukwe a supporter of Poto? And now again, we don't know whether Sobukwe said this, but according to Gail Gerhardt, Sobukwe said Poto are actually hooligans, thugs, murderers, and he does not want to have anything to do with them. Now, whether that is true or not, we will never know, because this thing was not actually written down. But the reality here is that we often ask, why is it that the apartheid state would have been so harsh towards Sobukwe? And the answer can only be this. In their minds, Sobukwe would have had secret connections to Poto. The fear for Sobukwe was, in fact, the fear for Poto. Whether real or perceived, the apartheid supremacists, white supremacists, could not ignore the fact that there may well be possible links between Sobukwe and Poto. And it is for that reason that they really wanted to get him, out of the equation completely. So, yes, what is it that we are looking at in Tsiki? This is the theme, in fact. The theme here is that white supremacy may have had concerns about the Roy Khepar, but white supremacy was particularly fearful of the Swart Khepar. And this was true for the 50s. It was true throughout the 1960s. It was true for the 70s. So when they dealt that systematic blow on Black Wednesday in October 1977, the idea was to deal with it for once and for all. And organizationally, they may have succeeded. So when we come back to the 1980s, at least we've dealt with the 1980s to the extent that we needed to, because we needed to demonstrate, that the Tami Zulu drama did not begin with his demise in 1990. Already the stage had been set. Tami Zulu was part of this black radical in the minds of the ANC and in the minds of MK, but also in the minds of probably the people who were presiding over his demise. He was a black radical that had to be dealt with. The most important thing to think about in relation to Tami is this. And I think this is something that we need to think about at all times. Tami seems to have affronted Jacob Zuma and Moses Mabhida when he was actually appointed to head the Natal Command. That seems to have been at the center of, the tensions or whatever tensions there may have been. And these may have laid, latent until 1987, when Jacob Zuma became head of Mbokodo. And for some reason in 1989, Tami Zulu was taken into detention. And, the charge was that he was an apartheid spy. So it was easy to do that because it was a continuation of the reaction to the Mkatashinga and the Vienna uprising. This is something that the ANC needed to do. It needed to cleanse itself of the impurities of the black radical tradition within its movement. And, by 1990, when Nelson Mandela comes out, I'm sure the ANC could proclaim quite bravely that they had dealt with the black radical tradition for once and for all. This is where the Gang of Eight comes into. The Gang of Eight was considered the Swart Khepar inside the ANC. and in 1975 they were taken out. So the issue here is that today it is so difficult to speak about the Black radical tradition. Is that in dealing with it, both the white supremacist state and Ukongolos, the Congress tradition, succeeded quite well, more meaningfully, in dealing with the Black radical tradition. I know this says much about two organizations that were supposed to be the custodians of this tradition, the PAC and AZAPO. And we are going to have to account for why is it that they were unable, to deal with this juggernaut, against the black radical paradigm. Okay. Okay. Any comments? I mean, any?
Okay, well, there is just a comment. It's not necessarily a question, but Barry, this part of history is not even mentioned in the current history. People are only told about the 76 youth, yet the youth of the 80s fought more than 76.
I think, yeah, this is interesting. I mean, this is interesting. I would hate to compare the youth of 76 to the youth of 84. But it's encouraging, that someone sees a difference between the youth of 76 and the youth of 84. That is important. The fact that someone recognizes that difference is absolutely important. The reason for that, Ntiki, is that there is a tendency in South African, and this is still the case up to this day. I know we've given this series of lectures, and to be honest, I think we have tried to demonstrate that Black Wednesday was the cutoff point for the 1970s movement. The 1980s movement is a completely different paradigm that is at work there. And this question does recognize that you are talking about two distinct periods. You're talking about two distinct mass movements. They are not one and the same.
And there was a, if I may,
yeah,
a move to reduce everything to 1976.
Yes, and this is the issue. The issue I've always been fighting against is the tendency in South Africa today to project the 1980s back onto 1976. And how is this being done? You often hear people say in 1976, so and so was necklaced. Now, that's one indicator of the fact that these are two distinct moments, that there were two distinct moments inspired by two different sets of political objectives. I've always emphasized, and I'm going to say this again, the injunction that comes out of the 1970s movement is that no political objective is worth pursuing if its realization depends on the visitation of violence on another black body. But you've just seen what happened with the guys at after the Vienna uprising. That is a tradition that is completely antithetical to the black radical paradigm of the black consciousness movement. But if this was done in exile, and this was done in 1984, 85, 84, and people were being punished like that, for being suspected of being spies. If that was done, in exile, it may well be that, it filtered through into the country, and it became known that this can actually be done. From the day one, of the mass movement of the 1980s, which is the 3rd of September 1984 in the Vaal, within the first hour of that movement, two of the Vaal's councillors had been brutally murdered and the mob was still going on, to get more people to be, to be put to the sword. But unfortunately, that actually, started to define what that movement was going to be about. So I guess what I'm saying to this comment is that yes, uh, the youth of 1984, would have spent even more time, involved in some kind of, but understand that 1976 did not end there. In terms of the youth of 76 inside MK, we are talking about them until 1984. And if you say that they contributed less, look at what the ANC did to them. And what was the reason for doing this? These people were not apartheid spies. These were committed cadres of the movement, people who were prepared to abandon the black radical paradigm and embrace the new paradigm. And yet they were persecuted in the ways that this was actually done. I think you need to consider the impact of the firing squad, even if it was only 7 people who were subjected to this execution. That in itself, the symbolism of it, goes deep. It just goes to show that the black radical tradition was an endangered species. So yes, the youth of 1976, their contribution did not only end in 1976. For those that did not join MK, there are those that stayed outside MK and they pushed on until around 1981. And this is what I often say about, Seiko. Khoza Siakolo made, again, let me just repeat this because, in a way, it answers this question. Khoza Siakolo and Tsietsi Mashinini decided in exile that they were not going to join the ANC or the PAC, and that students were going to establish an independent student youth movement in exile. That was done in 1979, and surely, if you think about it, the ability to do this in exile in Zambia, in Lusaka, to actually call a conference by students, at the time they were no longer students. This was 1979. It is about 3 years after 1976, but they were still relatively young. And it shows the determination to actually get things done. But there is something else about Khoza which really this statement would make you feel angry. Because this is what Khoza does. He says, the ANC went into exile in 1960. Between 1960 and 1975, we knew nothing about what they were doing. And as a result, when they started wanting to deploy people, they made a mess of it, precisely because they had lost sense of what the country was about and what was happening inside the country at this time. And Khoza felt that he's not going to fall victim to that. Instead, he was going to go back into the country as soon as it was possible to do so. But to do what? The idea was to go back to the high schools and establish structures within the high schools so that they can be able to liaise with the exiled movement, Seiko, in exile. And surely, Khoza traveled into South Africa, into Soweto in 1981 with the purpose of doing precisely that, organizing structures within the high schools. But at the time, in 1981 already, COSAS had been established 2 years earlier in Soweto and in Port Elizabeth. And at its formation, COSAS adopted the Freedom Charter, therefore aligning itself, to the Congress tradition, to Congolese, and they became the Charterists. Now, Khoza did, he knew this and he didn't care. He was going to establish, Seiko units inside the country. Unfortunately, it happened. It happened that within the first week, probably a couple of days of his arrival inside the country, he was, sold out by someone. The police raided the house he was at, and he was taken into custody. And this was in 1981. Now, this is just to demonstrate how important this is. A couple of years ago, I had a discussion with Andile Mngutama, and he says to me, Seiko were naive. The ANC would never have sent O.R. Tambo back into the country in 1963. But Seiko did this. Now it is up to this question to decide, just based on that. Is your statement really correct? Because the issue here is that Seiko, as an offshoot of the 1970s movement, the June 16 detachment inside MK, as an offshoot of the 1976 student movement, were really something else. They were a class act. And, to see them as being inferior to the 1984 class is a little unfair. But more so because the 1984 cohort found existing structures when they went out into exile. The class of 76 decided to establish their own structures independent of the ANC and the PAC. So when I say this is a class of 76 betrayed, it is a class of 76 betrayed. It is a race betrayed. The black race was betrayed here. The class of 76 was betrayed here. And I think for today, should we end it here, Nsiki, or should we?
No.
Shame, are you missing me? Shame, Brad Steve. Here's a question. Here's a question.
Yes.
If Ukongoloze and its armed wing, so to speak, was funded and supported by countries like the Soviet Union, who was supporting black radicals and Boko during this epoch?
Let's start with Boko. Boko did not need to be. Boko was the armed wing of the PAC inside the country, not in exile. In exile, it becomes APLA. But inside the country, it was Boko. So Boko inside the country do not need any arms at all. They had guns. They would actually buy shotguns, firearms. On 6 occasions, Boko attempted to assassinate Matanzima, in the Transkei, and they failed. In one of them, one of the chiefs. But firearms, ordinary firearms, .45, .38 police special. But mostly their weapon of choice was in fact a machete, a panga, and an axe. So they did, like I said, they were operating inside the country. But for the PAC, once they went into exile, they became dependent on the Chinese. Chairman Mao, was more receptive, to the PAC than he would have been to the bank. But here, let me add, a proviso here that the ANC would have made the first contact with Chairman Mao. They who asked everybody else inside the ANC to go to Peking and negotiate on behalf of the movement was Yusuf Dadoo. And this rubbed, the radicals inside the ANC up the wrong way, feeling that, he had done this to them. But yes, China was actually supporting the PAC at this time. But also the PAC was well received in the African Liberation Committee, which was a body, an armed, kind of military formation of the OAU. There was a dispute inside the African Liberation Committee over who to support in South Africa, whether to support the ANC or to support the PAC. The ANC's argument was that the PAC was a creation of CIA and that it shouldn't be supported, as a liberation struggle formation in South Africa. And that's what they say. Again, this is another case of how you deal with a black radical tradition. That's what the ANC did with the PAC in exile. They simply demonized the PAC as the creation of the CIA. And they substantiated this claim by showing that there was a link between the PAC and UNITA. And you know that UNITA was, in fact, also having a link with the SADF. So it is easy to actually come to that conclusion. But yes, the Chinese are also quite useful in helping the PAC. Outside of those, outside of China, the PAC, Azala, and probably if they lasted longer, Seiko, they would have looked to other sources, for arms. Libya would have been another option, particularly for the PAC. And I do think that at some stage they did make contact with Gaddafi's Libya, and probably even sent some people for training in Libya. Yes, Libya would have also been quite useful in this regard. But other ways of acquiring arms would have been to establish strategic relationships with organizations that were deemed to be involved in international terrorism in the 1970s and 1980s. The most prominent of these would have been the Irish Republican Army. There were attempts, I know, inside SEICO to try and establish links, with the Irish Republican Army, because they had the ability to source arms from Libya, from even the Soviet Union, as well as from China and other East European countries. So those would have been the sources, of arms for these alternative organizations. I hope I've answered that question.
Okay, I'm going to. Steve, Oscar Fela Moya, do you know that there are more than 400 people in class today?
No, I can feel more. I think you know what I'm concerned about. It's not me. We can go on until 12. My concern here is that we probably just started spontaneously, but this is becoming a kind of a series that is also has to be a lecture. And I'm thinking that, I'm trying to give a coherent account, of the demise of the Black radical tradition. So that my concern becomes the ways in which, the viewers are able to, to relate to this material. That is my concern. We can go on until 12.
The viewers love the show. That's all I can tell you, that they tell me all the time when I'm in the streets, Hakiliko Pick and Pay, Hakiliko Kai Kai, they tell me that they love Black Wednesdays. I can tell you. And Honabianung, Kibaba, more than 400. They could have chosen to be anywhere else, but more than 400 people are choosing to be here with you, to learn from you. It's very deliberate. We are aware that we want to be fed by you. We are here deliberately, Steve. There is a question here, and Tate Muller has got some comments here in the comment section there.
Yes.
Let me get it. All this fighting of the 80s movement amounted to was chasing of shadows exclusively within the Black townships. Whites were never involved.
Yes, you often actually hear, and this is particularly true, of the class of 84. After 1994, people tended to say, Hanerelwana le Maburu. And you wonder at what point did that actually happen? If they actually joined MK. Because let's think about what the struggle was for the Congress alliance, for the ANC and for the SACP, within the Congress alliance. They would have had a kind of analysis of the South African situation. And we often talk about, just in intellectual terms, what in fact is the decisive antagonism in South Africa. Let me explain what that means. In the 1980s, there was always there were always tensions between black radicals, if they were still in existence, and the Congress tradition represented by the UDF. You also had these tensions in the universities, particularly at Wits, where we were trying to deal with the situation in South Africa and understand what the decisive antagonism is. So what came out of that is the idea, the concept of the race and class divide in South Africa. So the black radical tradition, and in this case, it would have been Azapo, would have, been concerned about the fact that race is, in fact, the decisive antagonism, and that the struggle is against white supremacy. But the Congress tradition looked at that and said, but this is unscientific. This is not a scientific analysis of the South African situation. It is an ideological outburst without a proper understanding of the material conditions. What does that actually mean? What they actually meant was that this is a problem of a capitalist system. And therefore, what needs to be done is to attack the infrastructure that makes capitalism in South Africa to work. That is what the armed propaganda campaign was about. It was about the Silverton siege trio coming into South Africa, attacking power stations, attacking railway lines, attacking infrastructure that made capitalism work, and not attacking civilians. But if they were to attack civilians, then race would become the decisive antagonism, which is what was, the idea both inside the PAC, probably to a large extent, except that they too seem to prevaricate on this matter. The one moment, it is that, but the other, it is we are a one race kind of people. And that's when it becomes a lot more complex. But that's the issue. The issue is that white people were insulated, completely insulated from the mass movement of the 80s. They were completely insulated precisely because a great deal of energies were invested by all black political formations in fighting each other. So there was never a time or even a moment to consider to bring the violence closer to the white body. The violence was going to be restricted to the black body. And that is what happened, throughout that period until 1993.
Until forever.
This day,
To this day, it still is.
Your children are asking, so what actually happened to Sabela Pama?
This is interesting, Nzigi. There are parallels here, and this happened, quite a lot. Before Sabela Pama, interestingly, Zimbabwe, they fought a 5-year struggle around 1976, up to 1979. They actually worked hard to get rid of Smith, and Smith tried to put in Muzerewa, and they got rid of him. And after all that hard work, the one man who worked so tirelessly, to bring Smith to Lancaster was actually Josiah Tomokra. Josiah was commander-in-chief. He has a history. In 1975, the chairman of ZANU, his name was Herbert Chitepo, was assassinated, in Lusaka, not so far off from Kenneth Kaunda's home. A car bomb exploded and he died in that explosion. But Herbert Chitepo was a formidable figure. He was a very important person in ZANU. And getting rid of him was really going to cripple ZANU a lot. And Dongogara decided to take over. Now, he was commander-in-chief, and he took control of the situation. What then happened is that after Chitepo was laid to rest, Machel himself extended an invitation to Dongogara to bring Zanla forces over to Mozambique. And this is documented, because Machel was of the view that while ZANU and Zanla were operating from Lusaka, they were subjecting themselves to infiltration, and that tells you a lot about what, Samora Machel would have thought of the crowd in Lusaka at this time. And the crowd in Lusaka would have included the ANC, ZAPU, and SWAPO, and MPLA probably added to the mix. And that's the Russian connection. So, and if you think about it, I mean, Machel himself was of the Russian connection. He should have extended the invitation to ZAPU, but he didn't. He chose ZANU because he seemed to realize that ZANU would deliver, within record time. And ZANU did not disappoint Machel. By 1979, Smith was prepared to negotiate. What actually happened between 75 and 79, when Zanla was transferring to Mozambique, there was an attempt at a mutiny, while they were in the bush. And again, Tongogara came on top. He dealt with that, and they proceeded, into Tanzania and Mozambique, and they started wreaking havoc from the eastern provinces into Zimbabwe. Now, on the 16th, could have been around the 13th of April, 1980, on the eve of Tongogara returning to Zimbabwe for the independence celebration. It was a Sunday. He decided that he was going to have the last word with Samora Machel. So he went to the State House, met Samora, and bid him goodbye. They will meet, on Independence Day, and that's it. When he came out of the State House, he got into his car, and out of the blue, an army truck came, smashed his car, and he died on the spot. Now, Zimbabwe was robbed of a very capable leader on the eve of independence. Now, Sabelo Pama suffered the same fate. He was about to return to South Africa, and it was known, that APLA was inspired by him, which is why I take it upon myself now to probably look at what APLA had been doing between 85 and 89, because certainly APLA was not involved in Quito Carnivale. And at the time when they embarks on Operation Vula, it would be interesting to find out what APLA would have been doing. Because what that would help with, is to dispel the myth, because there's a myth going around that when APLA realized that the situation was coming to a kind of a settlement, they started attacking randomly in the hope of establishing their presence. The Akon Hook, the thing in the bar, where, white people were attacked and killed. The thing at St. James and Kenimutama's attack on the white police officer, and also Gabriel Mahakwe's, reign of terror in the Free State. All these are being seen as the PAC making a desperate attempt to assert themselves, inside, to mask the fact that they had been paralyzed all these years. But it would be fair to really, look into that and present, quite a more balanced, sort of account of what was happening to the PAC. Okay.
Okay, all right. There's a question here that says, was Carl Zimbiri a real person or a myth?
No, he was real. Zimbiri was for real. In this period, when there's a great deal of myth making, And well, it may well be, some people still believe he's a myth, but I never met him. But I don't get a sense that, he was only a myth. I do think that he was for real. Until such time that I'm shown, evidence to the contrary, I would still believe he was for real. And by the way, Jackie Sirwake was on FM this morning. And I do think that he's the one person who can deal with these issues most effectively. It would be fair. I think it would be fair for the PAC to get someone, who could at least give their side of the story.
I agree with you. I agree with you. I agree. I think PAC is in a bit of a compromised position at the moment, don't you think?
Yes, they are. The cynicism of the ANC by giving Nyonjo the land affairs, it's cynical. It's saying to him, we are giving you this land portfolio, but you will never get the land back. That's that's what he's being told, actually.
Yeah, and I'm also I don't get a very Afrocentric approach from the president of the PAC. It's almost like there's a misalignment between the leader and what the movement stands for.
Yeah, Nsiki, well, okay, you know what? I think this is something that I have always said. Going into 1994 and during that negotiations period, it was interesting to look at what the PAC was doing, not in terms of, military kinds of campaigns, but how they were attempting to establish themselves within the masses, leading up to 1994. Interestingly, at the time, I was actually on a shopping spree trying to find an organization that I could throw my lot with. So I did actually attend, two of PAC meetings. Or they were supposed to be PAC meetings. But the idea at the time, they were still about to establish their structure inside the country. So where the ANC would have had the UDF as their internal structure, the PAC had little known, and I know a lot of people don't know about this movement, but the PAC had AZANU. AZANU was the Azanian National Youth Union. And it had a strong kind of presence in Soweto, in Pimville, here in Diepkloof, in Orlando, in the Eastern Cape. They were a very strong, and in the East Rand, Katlehong in particular, you had a very strong AZANU presence there. And as usual, Kagiso Mohlakeng on the West Rand, a very strong, PAC presence. I'm still trying to respond to you, to the question about the PAC president's leader and his connection to the masses. And I think it is at that point that connection was, around this time that the connection was lost. AZANU was doing extremely well, in terms of mobilizing people for the PAC. But I went to this meeting in downtown Johannesburg, where internal structures were being established. And the meeting was actually convened by AZANU itself. Now, that is the meeting where I saw for the first time Benny Alexander, and I think he was actually being introduced. He was coming in as president of the South African Domestic Workers Association. It was a union of, domestic workers. And there was Cunningham Mngwani in the audience, and Cunningham was also very forceful, in asserting himself as a future leader of the PAC. But I immediately got a sense that in this process, the AZANU local leadership, and I hope I'm wrong about this, but I get a sense that the local or the internal AZANU leadership was being marginalized. And I happen to know these people personally. And over time, I saw that happening. And I saw people like Benny Alexander and Cunningham Mngwana, taking the center stage. And that was unfortunate because my sense was that Penny may well have been very articulate and he may be bringing in, SADWA, the South African Domestic Workers Union. But, Azanyu was commanding a great deal of support in the areas that I have actually referred to. And here was the PAC coming from outside and not really, embracing Azanyu as it should have. So what you then ended up having is that the leadership of Azanyu was being sidelined, By 1995, 96, I get a sense that they had actually lost interest. But for me, that was my last meeting actually going into the PAC meeting because I did get a sense that, they were going to mess it up. And they messed it up because once they lost Azanyu, it meant they actually lost the masses. So what you've been having inside the PAC has been a succession of leadership structures that had been detached from the masses from the very beginning, from the time around 1989 to 93, when the PAC was supposed to set itself up inside the country. They did not have the sense that their hope of getting through to the masses would have been through Azanyu. They should have dealt with Azanyu far more strategically than they did. And I think that accounts for their loss of membership and their loss of support. Do you agree with that?
Mm.
Now, let me answer this. This is important.
Yes.
This national dialogue, there's a sense among these people that there was going to be a national dialogue of the kind that South Africa had July 21, in 2021, but that this national dialogue was going to play itself out in the streets. Now, there was that anxiety, within the political elite. So what they did was to actually sabotage what is a looming national dialogue in the streets of South Africa. Because this, I'm sure, this was actually looming. So that national dialogue in the streets is now in the boardrooms. And this is the idea. The idea is yet another distraction. This is another distraction for the masses, particularly the black underclass masses, to look forward to something that is not there. All these, miasmas since 1994, 1996, the World Cup is coming, and people get consumed by all of these things that are nothing but just distractions. This is another distraction. And to spend 700 million on a distraction is quite generous, wasteful.
Reminds me of what's those trials again? State capture.
Yeah, yeah.
A billion.
Wasteful. It's wasteful.
What do
Okay.
you think of what do you think of our tendency? Because as you say, this is just another way to distract us. The way that we move in a mass and a mob, we even partake in mob justice, Tina. We choose leaders as a mob. We choose celebrities as a mob. What do you think of that approach of ours?
The unfortunate thing about the mass movement of the 1970s is precisely what we've done, since we started. The distraction attack on it. When people talk about leadership, as if leadership is everything, I get concerned. There were leaders, there was TH, there were leaders in the 19th, there was Biko, you could say, well, he was an intellectual, he was a thinker. But when we say, the mass movement of the 1970s was a collective effort, there was no sense that the leadership is detached from the masses. The masses were the leadership. This is why there was no sweat. THC leaves the country, Khotso comes in, because the entire mass is in fact the leadership. So in that kind of a context, and I see what you mean, and often, it would be a demagogue. A demagogue would establish what the mob should think about and what the mob should do.
Mm.
And until the demagogue, denounces a particular course of action, they will follow it. They will follow it to the letter. The difference between the 1970s movement and the 1980s movement, again, is precisely that, Ntiki. There was no way that you could, hoodwink the masses of the 1970s into doing something that was unacceptable. Look, yeah, again, I may be, it's a little sensitive here. But, if you think about the caliber of student that we had in the 1970s, and you compare them to the caliber of student of the 80s, and I talked about, where black is present and yet absent. That's the 80s phenomenon. In the 80s, you had that kind of phenomenon. And in
the watering
down of,
how people began and became evident.
Yes.
We were
So
progressively being watered down.
the 1970s, we were leading, the caliber of students that would challenge you. You couldn't just say something and they would, accept it. But I taught in the 1980s, and I know the caliber of student that I encountered in the 1980s. And I can safely say that, by comparison, they fell far short of what the student of the 1970s would have been like. But there's also an institutional reason for that, and this is something that we are going to talk about when we look at the mass movement of the 1980s and how they played themselves out in the high schools. And one of the things you are going to talk about is the impact of colleges of education, the caliber of teachers that came out of colleges of education, and the caliber of students that those teachers actually produced in the 1980s. We are going to be talking about that. But I think it does, attempt to answer the question. You could actually, lead a mob psychology of a mob of the 1980s, precisely because of the caliber of the mass that you had as compared
So
to
that means that means then it's almost a genetic, I don't know if it's a genetic trauma, because then it means we're coming from a history of mass mobilization and mass movement. And even though we are not in the struggle in the same way, like if you watch social media, there's still that sense of mass and mob movement, just obviously playing out in our generation, in our context. So then, is it effective? Does it work for us? And because what I'm finding is that if you spoke of demigods, we choose one celebrity and then we all center ourselves around this one celebrity, and it's no longer really about the principle. Whereas in the past, in the struggle politics of the past, it was about abantu and the whole community, but it's not necessarily about that now.
Yes, Ntiki. And but again, this is a kind of an institutional reimagining of total strategy itself. Because in the process of fragmenting the unity of the black race, it had to compartmentalize black people into individuals of that kind. And that actually becomes, what defines the 1980s. You have a situation, and I often use the term that the 1970s were marked by or defined by a collectivist logic. But that collectivist logic was taking place in a context in which there was a great deal of maturity about political issues, about things, about things that people learned. But Nziki, in the 1980s, you have a completely different kind of setup, and this is an important, issue to deal with at this stage, because part of what happens here is that the thinking for the 1980s movement does not grow within, within black society itself. It is imposed from outside. Now, you are looking at people who are receiving an ideological and intellectual, kind of apparatus from an outside source, and it doesn't grow within, organically from within society. And already, in that kind of a situation, there is no critical assessment of what it is that people are actually doing. And it is for that reason that they act as a mob. But in the 1970s, we are acting as a collective, precisely because as individuals, we can be able to offer a critique of what is happening here. We are not merely sitting there being absent even when we are present. This is a phenomenon of the 1980s because Black society is dealing with the kinds of categories and paradigms that are actually imposed on them from the outside, and they are able to make them intelligible. And I know, I mean, I'm putting my head on the block here. That is me asserting that this is the case. No one else would say that, but I'm saying the phenomenon of the 1980s was precisely that. It absented a Black when even they were present, and it made the white present even when they were absent. And in that kind of a context, you have people acting as a mob.
Yeah, I wonder if it's,
Yes.
yeah, I wonder.
Dadimulora
Yes.
wants to react to it.
No, I'm not.
Uh-huh.
I'm just making the point that what's going on in Kenya right now with the Gen Z uprising, the so-called leaderlessness of anybody that gets pulled off the streets and interviewed seems to be articulate about the objectives and the and the moving concerns of the movement. It seems everybody is a person of this thing. You see what I'm saying?
Did you hear that?
So
Yes.
this is no mystery. You know what I'm saying? It is occurring, unfolding right before our eyes right now. So we need to take note. Thank you.
Yes, and that's the Kenya thing. And maybe for the viewers who did not hear, I mean, Dadimulora is actually responding to this and saying this is precisely what is happening in Kenya. That anybody who gets pulled off the streets and get beaten up, they know what this movement is about. And this is a distinction I'm trying to make here. And I'm saying I'm putting my head on the block that the 1970s movement would be, a mirror of what's happening in Kenya today.
Your phone keeps shaking the camera. I'm sorry.
Okay, Nzige, are we still?
No.
It's interesting. It's interesting because it's the difference between mob and collective.
Yes.
So that is something to reflect upon. And just to end off here, I see a comment.
Yeah, but
from,
Nzige, before we end here, Nzige,
Yes.
before we end here, unfortunately, my opening today was meant to be a comment. And this is a comment on what happened in the past 2 days, just to show the viewers that what we are doing here can quite easily, although it is history, we can quite easily connect it to present kinds of developments. 2 days
Yes.
ago, a notice came up saying Maibuye is going to have this consultative conference, and Maibuye is going to bring South Africa closest to the Freedom Charter. It's something like that. I don't know if people understood it in those terms, but what it was saying is that those who see the Freedom Charter as a vision, as providing a vision for South Africa, Maibuye is going to make that possible. Ntiki, I thought, I hope, those that were attending last week would remember what my assertion was. My opening statement was that the Freedom Charter was weaponized against Africa for the Africans, against a Black radical tradition of the 1950s. And I explained that the Africa for the Africans movement comes out of the 1920s and 30s when the ANC was defunct and therefore not part of the Africa for the Africans movement. And that in the 1950s, it is the PAC that comes up with the slogan, isolate, and the Freedom Charter is not, in any way part of the Africa for the Africans movement. But this is interesting, black radicals, especially of latter day black radicals in the political arena, still believe that the Freedom Charter is a black radical, kind of document, produced by black radicals. And if you want to ask, but who was at the center of its drafting? Z.K. Matthews is actually being brought up. And for those who may not be aware, Z.K. Matthews was, in fact, Naledi Panda's grandfather. Naledi Panda's father, Joe Matthews, was Z.K. Matthews' son. So they are ramming down they are ramming the Freedom Charter down Z.K. Matthews' throat and insisting that he was actually the man behind it. But the issue here is that, even if Z.K. Matthews would have conceptualized the Freedom Charter, he certainly would have not subscribed to the idea of Africa for the Africans, Israel, in the way that the Africanists inside, the ANC would have done in the 1950s. He himself was, part of the Congress alliance, part of the Congress tradition. But the interesting thing also that I wanted to point out here, just to substantiate the fact that the Freedom Charter was weaponized against, Africa for the Africans. In 1959, Joe Slovo writes this. He doesn't say it, he writes it, reflecting on the decade. And if you think about the decade, 1950 was the May Day protest, the first in South Africa, 52, the defense campaign, 55, destructions of Firetown, 56, Women's March. He's reflecting on all of this. And what he's saying is that he's worried that white society was voting the National Party increasingly. Remember, in 1948, the National Party won a slender victory. They increased their margins in 1953, showing that white people were moving towards white supremacist party, the NP. In 1958, they had actually escalated their numbers quite considerably. And Slovo was responding to this. He was saying he laments the fact that white society is moving increasingly to the right. But this is what he said to white people. And he wrote this in the newsletter of the Congress of Democrats. He said, but I take comfort in the fact that we in the Congress of Democrats, as members of the Congress Alliance, have made sure that black politics do not swing to the extreme left. Now, what classical example of the 1950s is an indication that black politics did not move to the extreme left? It is the Freedom Charter. It is the flagship program or project of the 1950s that illustrate that black politics have not moved to the extreme left. Because if they had, the Freedom Charter would have said, South Africa is late. We want our country back. It would have said so, but it didn't. It said it's for all of us. So Slovo was right. They worked hard to make sure that black politics do not become radically black.
In effect, you are suggesting that Maibuye is incongruous with the Freedom Charter.
Yes,
Maibuye results is an artifact of the Ethiopianist movement of the 19th century and the Gavian Africa for the Africans movement of the 1920s.
Yes.
This is who coined it and brought it into the ANC. It is the Freedom Charter's entire base movement and motivation was to extinguish that.
Yes.
So there's a basic an oxymoron in suggesting that the Freedom Charter and Maibuye could go along in the same sentence.
And Ziggy, I think Floyd really needs to be alerted to this, because if they keep doing this, if they keep, talking about them being Maibuye and at the same time embracing the Freedom Charter. These are two things that historically are incompatible.
Yes.
The cynicism of the ANC to even so that even as it moved against the content of the Black radical movement and the Africa for the
keeps the
Africans movement,
symbols.
it keeps the symbols in order to entrance the people, because the symbols are what is needed to mobilize the people. You can't cast away the symbols, even though you hollow out the substance of the people's content. You see?
Yes.
So you can keep on mesmerizing the people without their content. True cynicism, historic cynicism.
Okay.
Yes, it's a very good point you're making because yes, he is you're right. Floyd is talking left but walking right,
Yeah.
is what you're saying.
Yes. See, but I think, I hope increasingly we are beginning to see what the fate of the Black radical tradition is. It was a waking paradigm. It stood no chance. It had to be dealt with.
Had to be murdered.
But then it could, is it not argued that it actually exists? If Black Wednesday exists now in 2025, does it not mean that Black Wednesday was not killed?
Blowing at the embers.
Yeah, it does actually, but think about it, and very quickly, I'm going, now this is the last point I'm going to make. If you think
Yeah.
about it, I mean, throughout the 1980s, as an academic, kind of undertaking, I was telling the Demolora today that, looking at the 1980s and thinking about Ford Foundation, for instance. Ford Foundation is an American foundation that pumped in obscene amounts of dollars, into South African academia, promoting research. But this research was, in fact, also weaponized against the Black radical tradition in higher education and in academia. Because what they did, Ford Foundation actually funded projects that were intended to establish the Marxist-Leninist, paradigm. We call it Marxist-Leninist revisionist paradigm across the humanities. You're talking sociology, you had Belinda Bozzoli, and Eddie Webster. And if you think about it, these are academics that were, in fact, that were mentors, to very prominent Black, kinds of politicians that you encounter today. And they would actually include, Andile Mngitama, Teritzelane, Mbuyiseni Ndlozi. They all come out of that kind of academic kind of, environment that was meant to create Marxist-Leninist thinkers, who along the way wanted to adopt a kind of a Black radical paradigm into this Marxist left, Marxist Leninist kind of paradigm, and ended up making a mess of it. And this is what I pointed out to Andile, that the problem with your Black radicalism is that it was crafted by the radical white left in South Africa. And that's a historical fact.
There's a question here asking, Guti, can the EFF, with its rhetoric, lay claim to a Black radical movement?
I wasn't going to mention the EFF, but in fact, come to think of it, I mean, the EFF comes just in terms of its, intellectual and ideological constructions. Its Black radicalism comes out of that tradition. These are young guys, who went to Wits, encountered Marxist scholars at Wits. I did too. I mean, I encountered, Marxist scholars at Wits, and I was subjected to that. And there was no space, for conceptualizing anything, along Black radical lines, because that was completely, discouraged completely. And if it was mentioned, if anything of the Black radical thinking was mentioned, it was only as a straw man to be beaten down again. This we do with anyone. We did that with Walter Rodney. and dismissed him, and then established our paradigm within the Marxist tradition. And that's what happened. The EFF and its think tank, whether it is Floyd, Ngozi, they all come out of this Marxist-Leninist, kind of training. And they wanted to adapt that kind of radicalism because it is the radicalism of the Roy Khefar and not of the Swart Khefar. But they wanted to adapt it to a black radicalism, and it just does not work. So the EFF is not a black radical movement. It is a movement crafted by white radicals, the white left at West, in terms of its ideological and intellectual orientation.
The EFF is a white is the EFF a white liberal party?
No, I'm saying just in terms of the ideological apparatus available to them, if they can be, if that ideological outlook of the EFF, including those that have left already, that have and that includes Floyd as well, and Ngozi as well. These were Wits students. They learned what I learned at Wits. I was a politics 3 student at Wits taught by Peter Hudson. And I know what Peter Hudson would have done just in terms of shaping people's minds about the race and class debate in South Africa. And my assertion, and Andile knows this, we have talked about it. My assertion is that their black radicalism is founded on the white left, Roy Khefar, kind of radicalism that they learned at Wits. And
that's why I'm saying that they're white liberals. That's what I'm saying. The EFF is a white liberal party.
You said it, Ziggy.
The fighters are gonna come and murder me on my timeline.
Yeah, you said it. Ziggy, I think the next time we meet, let's look at how is P.W. Botha reimagining the internal, South African public sphere. This is a piece of social, we call it a piece of social engineering. It's a massive social engineering that went into reimagining the South African public sphere in the 1980s. And part of it included what we call a kind of population engineering, a displacement of whole populations and placing them in certain locations to undermine particular traditions in those locations where they are placed. I'm talking here about Gauteng. There was a need, to undertake a population kind of engineering and move hordes of people into Gauteng. The idea here was to submerge the Swart Khefar of Gauteng, for the 1980s. Partly, the black on black violence can be explained in those terms. And you will see how we are, connecting these together.
So next week is gonna be a really interesting one, huh?
Okay, yeah, I'm sure I'm sure it will be.
It will be quite an interest. Okay, so I was just checking if there's one more thing.
No.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay, Steve, I see that the team wants to go home. Thank you again for your time.
If there's anything, there is. I mean, if there isn't, fine.
Yeah, Tiba, hey, we're always quite selfish with you.
I know. No, we are okay. I mean, we are definitely.
We've covered all the important parts. So we'll see each other next week, Wednesday, as usual. Got 6.
Yes, yeah. Okay, yes.
Thank you, Steve. We always appreciate your time and space and your wisdom.
Thanks.
Bless you. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm ending the stream.